There is a smell that an entire generation of American boys can still describe from memory decades after the last time they experienced it. Polystyrene cement and warm plastic. A kitchen table covered in newspaper to protect the surface from glue that would inevitably end up everywhere except where it was supposed to go. A pair of nail scissors pressed into service because nobody could find the hobby knife. The small sharp satisfaction of separating a piece from the sprue and holding it up to the light to check the detail before cementing it into place. And on the shelf above the bed, when it was finally done after a week of afternoons and one ruined Sunday, a battleship or a fighter jet or a submarine that you had built yourself with your own two hands and that would sit there for years accumulating dust and meaning in roughly equal measure. The company that put that smell in the air was called Revell. At its peak, it sold more plastic model kits than any company in the Western Hemisphere. By 1956, more than 80% of American boys were building models, and most of them had started with a Revell kit bought at a Woolworth's or a drugstore or a hobby shop for less than $3. The factory that made those kits was in Venice, California, a building that smelled of resin and machine oil and the particular productive hum of a place that knew exactly what it was for. That factory is gone. The molds were crated and trucked to Illinois in 1986. The name still appears on boxes, but the box is shipped from Germany. And in April 2018, the company that invented American plastic model kits ceased all operations and sold its entire legacy to a German investment group for $3.9 million, which was less than the price of a house in the neighborhood where the founder had built his factory 7 decades earlier. The distance between those two facts, the 80% of American boys and the $3.9 million bankruptcy sale, is the story. It is a story about what happens when a category-defining company changes hands enough times that the people running it no longer remember why it mattered. It is a story about a hobby that outlasted the industry built to serve it. And it is a story about a German subsidiary that started in a former cigar factory and ended up inheriting everything, which is either a parable about the durability of genuine commitment or simply what happens when you give a capable operation room to grow while the parent company is busy being sold. Louis H. Glaser was not a toy man. He was a plastics manufacturer. That distinction matters enormously to everything that follows because it determined how he thought about quality, what he was willing to spend on a mold, and why the company he built produced objects of a precision that eventually got him accused of leaking nuclear submarine secrets to the Soviet Union. Glaser understood tolerances. He understood cycle times and resin costs and the mathematics of injection molding at a level that most toy company executives never needed to learn because they were buying their manufacturing from someone else rather than running it themselves. When Glaser made a decision about a product, it was grounded in a knowledge of what the machines could do and what it would cost to make them do it correctly, which is a very different foundation from a toy man's instinct about what children want. In 1943, he founded a plastics molding company called Precision Specialties in Venice, California. The timing and the location were both fortunate. The war had left Southern California flush with two things that mattered enormously to a man in the plastics business: surplus raw material that the military was no longer consuming and second-hand machine tools that manufacturers were selling off at prices that reflected the chaos of industrial demobilization rather than the actual value of the equipment. Glaser bought both. He started with contract molding work, making whatever clients needed made, and supplemented that with a small line of consumer products. HO scale train sets at 1 hour 87 minutes ratio. Locomotives and freight cars and passenger stations and the kind of miniature agricultural buildings that sat in the windows of 5-and-dime stores and sold for whatever a child had in his pocket. He called the brand Revell, reportedly from the French word réveil meaning awakening, which in retrospect sounds either prophetic or like the kind of name you choose when you are a small plastics contractor who does not yet know what the name will eventually stand for. The train sets moved, but they did not move fast enough to suggest a future, and Glaser was honest enough with himself to recognize the difference between a business that was building towards something and one that was simply keeping the machines running. That clarity of self-assessment was about to prove decisive. In 1952, English toy designers named Gowland arrived with a licensing proposition for a set of miniature vintage cars that had failed to find an audience in Britain. The cars were charming and well-made, and British consumers had looked at them and moved on to something else. The Gowlands believed the problem was cultural rather than intrinsic to the product. American boys had a different relationship to automobiles than English boys did. The car was not just transportation in post-war America. It was aspiration, identity, the physical embodiment of freedom in a culture that had organized its geography around the assumption that everyone would eventually own one. Miniature cars at 1/32 scale, detailed enough to reward close examination and cheap enough to collect, might land differently in a Woolworths in Los Angeles than they had in a shop in London. Glazer thought so too. He bought the license, put the cars in Woolworths at 69 cents apiece, and watched what happened. What happened was that they sold out. Then the second run sold out. Then the third. For series eventually, 30 miniature vintage automobiles total, each one small enough to sit in a child's palm and cheap enough that a parent standing at the register did not need to calculate whether the purchase was reasonable. They were unreservedly reasonable. They were also, by the standards of what the toy industry was producing in 1950, extraordinarily well made. Glazer looked at what the Gowland cars were telling him and made the decision that would define the next 4 decades of American childhood. He took everything Revell was making, the train sets, the contract molding jobs, the miscellaneous toys, all of it, and eliminated it. Every product line that was not a plastic assembly kit was gone by 1952. One factory. One category. One complete commitment to a single bet on what American boys wanted to do with their Saturday afternoons. It was the kind of decision that looks obvious from a sufficient distance and requires genuine nerve when you are actually standing inside it, because you are not adding a new revenue stream, you are destroying your existing ones to make room for something that has not yet proven it can replace them. The first kit that came out of that concentrated bet was the USS Missouri, a 1/535 scale replica of the battleship where Japan had signed the surrender 6 years earlier, packed in a narrow box with hand-painted illustration on the front and shipped to hobby counters across the country at $2.98. 3 aircraft kits followed fast, the F-94C Starfire, the F-7U Cutlass, and the F-9F Cougar, each one coming with Revell's signature globe base for desktop display, a small plastic pedestal that turned a child's bedroom shelf into something between an airfield and a museum. The detail on the aircraft was, by the standards of the early 1950s plastic toy industry, startling. You could see the panel lines. You could see the cockpit instrumentation. You could see, if you looked closely enough, the individual rivets on the fuselage skin. In Morton Grove, Illinois, a company called Monogram Models that had been building balsa wood kits of wartime aircraft and ships since 1945 looked at what was happening to their shelf space and made the same pivot that Glazer had made 2 years earlier, releasing a bright red plastic race car and swearing off balsa permanently. Monogram had been the first name in American model building. When a competitor with better tooling and a more systematic approach to accuracy started eating their market from the coasts inward, Monogram responded with everything they had. And the competition that followed between these two companies for the next 30 years made both of them better than either would have been without the other. Revell released a jet. Monogram released a bomber. Revell launched a ship series. Monogram answered with a destroyer. Revell went into rockets and space hardware as the space race accelerated. Monogram built armor and vehicles. Each category one company entered, the other followed within months. The arms race played out in hobby shop aisles and 5-and-dime store displays from coast to coast, and the children who benefited from it did not know they were watching one of the more productive commercial rivalries in American manufacturing history. They just knew that the selection kept getting better and the detail kept getting sharper and the boxes kept arriving with new things on the front that they had not yet built. By 1955 Revell had introduced the S logo, a yellow letter in a red oval stamped on every box end, and the box art from this period had become something that the adults who grew up buying those boxes now trade and collect like prints. The paintings were not decorations. They were promises made to a specific customer standing in a specific aisle making a specific decision. A 14-year-old standing in a Woolworths in 1957 was looking at a hand-painted illustration of a gleaming aircraft in flight or a warship cutting through heavy seas and understanding, at a level below language, that this was the finished object he could build with his own hands if he had the patience and the $2.98 and the free afternoons. The promise on the front of the box was the entire sales argument. Everything else was secondary. Glazer understood something about that promise that separated him from every other man running a toy company in the 1950s. He understood that the promise had to be kept. A child who opened a Revell box and found parts that did not fit together cleanly, or detail that was soft and vague where the box art had shown it sharp and precise, would not open a second Revell box. The word would spread the way bad word of mouth always spread among children, through the immediate social network of the classroom and the neighborhood, faster and more durably than any advertising could counteract. Accuracy was not a marketing position. It was the product. Everything printed on the outside of the box was packaging for the accuracy inside it. This is why Glazer authorized his engineers to spend up to 7,000 hours on a single mold. 7,000 hours. For a product that would retail for under $3. The mathematics of that decision do not make sense if you are thinking about short-term margin. They make complete sense if you are thinking about what happens when a child opens the box and what that child tells the next child and what that next child decides to spend his allowance on the following Saturday. Glazer was not optimizing for the transaction. He was optimizing for the relationship, which in 1955 was an unusual way for a toy manufacturer to think and in 2024 would be described as customer lifetime value and celebrated as visionary in a business school case study. The 7,000-hour mold standard produced something that nobody at Revell had anticipated when they applied it to the 1961 Polaris missile submarine. The USS George Washington submarine kit was so precisely detailed in its engine room configuration that Vice Admiral Hyman G. Rickover, the father of the Navy's nuclear submarine program, went public with a formal complaint about national security. The New York Times ran it on the front page. The headline read, "Admiral Rickover says Reds learned secrets from toy sub." Rickover's quote made every wire service in the country. He said that if he were a Russian he would be most grateful to the United States for its generosity in supplying such detailed technical information for $2.98. The conventional corporate response to a front-page story accusing your company of leaking classified defense secrets to a hostile foreign power would be an immediate apology, a product recall, and a very expensive and very quiet conversation with lawyers. Glazer did none of those things. He sent his public relations department into what one account later described as combat mode and proceeded to reframe the entire controversy as the most credible product endorsement in the history of American toy manufacturing. If a vice admiral in charge of the nuclear submarine program was worried about the accuracy of a $2.98 hobby kit, the accuracy must be genuinely extraordinary. The argument was perfect because it was also true. Revell had not obtained classified documents. Revell had simply applied the same obsessive standard of accuracy to a submarine that they applied to every other subject in the catalog, and the standard was so high that the result was indistinguishable from a security breach. The kits kept shipping. Sales increased. By the early 1960s the catalog ran to hundreds of subjects. Aircraft and warships and rockets and space stations and vintage cars and custom hot rods and guided missiles and atomic power plants and suburban homes. If it existed in the physical world and a boy between the ages of 8 and 16 might conceivably want to build a scale replica of it, Revell made a kit. But Glazer was beginning to understand that accuracy had a natural ceiling as a competitive differentiator. Every competitor could claim accuracy. Monogram claimed accuracy. The Japanese manufacturers who were beginning to enter the American market claimed accuracy. Accuracy was necessary, but it was no longer sufficient to explain why a child in a Woolworth's aisle reached for a Revell box instead of the one next to it. Glazer needed something that accuracy could not provide. He needed personality. In the early 1960s he found it in the form of a custom car designer named Ed Roth who operated out of Beverly Hills under the name Big Daddy and who had built a following among the hot rod community by airbrushing monsters onto car hoods and selling t-shirts that would not have looked out of place in a tattoo parlor. Roth's most famous creation was the Ratfink, a bug-eyed, teeth-bearing, drooling green rodent conceived explicitly and with considerable creative aggression as the anti-Mickey Mouse. Where Mickey was clean and cheerful and corporate and safe, Ratfink was grotesque and irreverent and represented the part of American boyhood that wanted to put a skull on something rather than a smile. Roth understood his audience with a precision that most professional marketers could not have matched. Glazer signed a licensing deal with Roth that paid 1 cent per kit sold bearing his name. In 1963 that came to $32,000, meaning Revell had sold 3.2 million Roth-licensed kits in a single year. The Surfite, a single-seat beach car with a surfboard occupying the space where a passenger seat would have been, appeared in a beach movie and became something that teenagers talked about in terms that had nothing to do with scale accuracy. The rat think appeared on t-shirts in schoolyards across America. Roth gave Revell something it had never possessed before, an identity that lived outside the box and made the act of choosing a Revell kit feel like an act of self-expression rather than simply a purchase. Monogram countered by hiring designer Tom Daniel, whose Lil Coffin Show rod came complete with a plastic skeleton in the driver's seat and became one of their best-selling kits of all time. The two companies were now competing not just on the technical quality of their molding but on attitude, on cultural positioning, on which brand a specific kind of American boy wanted to be associated with on his bedroom shelf. The competition made both companies more interesting and the hobby richer, and the children who were growing up inside it had no idea they were the beneficiaries of one of the more creative commercial rivalries in American consumer products history. In 1965, Glazer made the first significant mistake of his tenure as the dominant force in American model kits. He acquired International Raceways and opened a 17,000-square-foot Revell Raceway slot car facility in Los Angeles featuring 6 track configurations. Commercial clients could order full room-size tracks fabricated by Revell for up to $8,000. Slot cars were, in 1965, unambiguously the hottest thing in American hobby retail. Every boy who had ever built a model wanted one, and the market was expanding at a rate that made almost any investment in the category look conservative. Glazer invested heavily. The slot car craze collapsed within 2 years. Too many manufacturers had entered the market simultaneously, the price competition destroyed margins across the industry, the barriers to entry were low enough that quality varied wildly and consumer trust eroded quickly, and the category discovered that it had a lower ceiling of durable interest than the initial enthusiasm had suggested. Revell had bet on a trend instead of a foundation, and the trend evaporated before the investment could be recovered. It was the first time Glazer had misread the room. The mistake was survivable because the core business was strong. But it was a warning that the discipline that had built Revell, the refusal to chase novelty at the expense of substance, was not a permanent organizational characteristic. It was a personal one, and personal characteristics do not automatically transfer when companies change hands. In 1956, while the Venice factory was still in its golden age, Glazer had made a quiet international decision that nobody at the time could have identified as the decision that would ultimately preserve the Revell name into the 21st century. He founded a German subsidiary called Revell Plastics GmbH, first in Bielefeld and then relocated to a building in the neighboring town of Bund that had previously been used to manufacture cigars. The connection between cigar manufacturing and plastic model kit production is not obvious and was not intended to be. The building was available and the price was right, and those were the criteria that mattered. For 15 years the Bund operation did nothing more than import kits designed in Venice and distribute them to the German and broader European market. It was a logistics outpost. It had no design capability, no independent production, no identity of its own beyond being the place where Revell boxes arrived from California before being forwarded to German hobby shops. Then in 1971 the Bund team developed its own first original product without involvement or direction from California. A 1:8 scale BMW or 75/5 motorcycle, designed in Germany, tooled in Germany, sold under the Revell name but conceived entirely within the subsidiary's own emerging capabilities. It was a small assertion of independence, a single product development cycle completed without the parent company's guidance, but it established something important. The German operation could do this. Through the 1970s, Revell Germany acquired mold tooling from defunct British manufacturer Frog, expanded its distribution network into Eastern Europe, and built out a research and development pipeline that operated on its own timeline and served its own assessment of what the European market wanted. By the mid-1980s, Bund had a design department, a production facility, and a product line that the Venice operation did not control and, increasingly, did not fully track.